Thank you. Well, it's quite an arresting image, isn't it? It's quite a striking image, and here's an artist's impression of this brimstone and fire which was rained down upon Sodom and Gomorrah by the Lord for their immorality at the time. So these were major cities of the area, as we read in the Bible. And as I say, it's a striking image, and it's an image that's resonated through the ages, and we'll see a couple of pieces of artwork in a moment. We'll see actually how it entered into the Egyptian literature, the Hebrew literature, as an event for remembrance, really. To this day and age, many people, even people who aren't so familiar with their Bibles, will be at least somewhat familiar with this idea of Sodom and Gomorrah, cities destroyed by God, using fire and brimstone. But I guess in this day and age, a lot of people would be pretty sceptical, wouldn't they, about it seems maybe a far-fetched image of, fire and brimstone from heaven destroying a city. It's not something you see every day, is it? And yet, what we're going to see is that there's solid evidence being developed or being discovered in that area, even to this day, which supports that this idea here, that the account in the Bible is not a fantastical account of God's judgment on a fictitious city, but is an eyewitness account of a real destruction of real cities by, I would put it to you, a real God. That evidence is solid, and we're going to see some of that in these slides. So, to introduce it, as I mentioned, it's a topic that's really captured the imagination. This is a painting that we've been seeing for a few moments now, called The Destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, painted by a chap named John Martin in the mid-19th century. Rather earlier, in the 16th century, you have Lucas van Leyden rendering he calls it Lot and his daughter, so that's the foreground scene, and then in the background then you have this idea of fire and brimstone from heaven raining down to the destruction of these cities. And actually rather more recently, in fact in the 21st century, we have an archaeological dig going on in the relevant area of the Middle East, but led by Dr. Stephen Collins from the US. And so he's spent quite a few seasons now, dig seasons, excavating some tells, some destroyed cities in Western Jordan, actually. So actually it's from that work that we're going to be drawing a lot of our material this afternoon. I mentioned that it had become a bit of a byword in both Egyptian literature and Hebrew documents from ancient times. So this area of the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah became called Abel, that is to say a place of mourning. It's referenced in Egyptian map lists of the 18th dynasty. It's referenced in ancient Hebrew documents, in our Old Testament, if you will. And so in Genesis 50, for example, it's called Abel Mizraim, that is to say the mourning of Egypt. And in Numbers 33 and Joshua 2, it's called Abel Shittim, Shittim being the name of the acacia trees, which apparently were plentiful in the area. It's the mourning of the acacias. And actually this morning, when we talked about Israel's problem with Baal Peor, it was at Abel Shittim that they were stationed at that time, which is why we know it in this area. And we'll get on to exactly what area we're talking about in a moment. In fact, Sodom is referenced all the way from Genesis 10 all the way through to Revelation. It resonates through the Bible, this record of the destruction of entire cities by God for their sins. Now, Dr. Collins, we mentioned, he suggests that when Joseph and his retinue, including various Hyksos, that is to say Egyptian officials, when they brought Jacob's body to Hebron, that's Jacob, Joseph's father, they took the long way round the Dead Sea in order to mourn over Jacob. Remember, Abel, place of mourning. He suggests that they came to this place to mourn over Jacob at the huge area of standing stones. And again, we'll see some of that. Huge area of standing stones at Sodom. And we can imagine the wind covering this mourning group in the ashes of Sodom, which even today, those ashes give the surface of the mound a crunch underfoot after rain. So in those days, you can imagine it would have been even more obviously ashen. In Moses' time, as I say, it was called Abel Shittim, the morning of the acacias. And so we feel it perhaps had become overgrown by these gnarly trees by this stage. And it makes sense if this byword for destruction and mourning would be visible to people who would pass by it in those days, rather than, according to some theories, sunken under the Dead Sea. You see, there's been quite some discussion over where Sodom might have been. And so let's get to this point of where would we expect, from the Bible anyway, where would we expect to find the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah, and why? Why would we expect to find them? And so we'll see how the biblical view of the location is rather clear, and also we'll think for a moment as well why a big city would be in this place. Why would this place be home to the centre of a major Bronze Age city-state, which, as we'll see, is what Sodom was. And the two are very linked, as we'll see. And so I mentioned there's been various theories as to where you might find the city of Sodom, and I've got some red spots on the map there, generally around the Dead Sea. Some of them in the Dead Sea, some of them people say, oh well, the Dead Sea levels rose and covered it. Actually, the evidence suggests that the Dead Sea water level is similar now as it was in the time of Abraham, and so it's not under the Dead Sea. We can be fairly confident of that. But there's, yes, all these different theories, and lots of people seem to think that it should be located at the south of the Dead Sea. In fact, actually, the Bible is very, very clear that we should expect to see it on the east side of that. I should have brought myself a pointer. There we are. Yes, the Bible is very clear that we should expect to find it on the east side of that disc of land, if you will, that disc of land just to the north of the Dead Sea, that disc, that well-watered plain. And I've pointed out Bethel there because the Bible says that it's visible from Bethel. Now this spot, and we'll get on to the reasons why it should be this spot, but this spot, for, shall we say, political reasons, has been inaccessible to archaeology for most of the duration of time in which archaeology has been a thing. It's only in recent years, and in fact in 2006, Dr. Collins and his team began this dig. So it's only in recent years that it's been possible to do an archaeological dig in that spot. And so it is that people have had lots of different theories, but nobody's been actually able to go to this spot. So why is it that we're saying that we should expect to see Sodom just about there? Well, come with me to Genesis chapter 13 and verse 10. Genesis 13 verse 10, we read, Lot lifted up his eyes and beheld all the plain of Jordan. Well, if you think about the Jordan's in a very tight valley, and there's only one spot in the Jordan where you would call it a plain, and that's this area here. In fact, if you think of the word plain there, the original Hebrew speaks to it. The Hebrew is for a disc of bread. It's a disc shape. It's a disc shape rather than a plane as such. And so here you have a plane which is disc shaped, broadly speaking. And so here we have Lot lifting up his eyes. And where is he? He's in Bethel, and he lifts up his eyes and he sees the plain of the Jordan, that disc shaped space of the Jordan. And by the way, if we were in the south of the Dead Sea, there is no Jordan. The Jordan is north of the Dead Sea. There is well watered everywhere before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah, even as the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt, as thou comest to Zoar. And Lot chose him all the plain of Jordan. He journeyed east. So it's east of Bethel. It's the plain of the Jordan. It's the disc of the Jordan. And they separated themselves one from the other. So they would have been separated then by the Jordan itself when he got to the east side of the plain. And Lot dwelled in the cities of the plain, pitched his tent toward Sodom. And so it seems like Sodom would have been at the far extent of the disc. You see how we're building up a picture that we would expect to see Sodom at this eastern end of this disc of the Jordan. And just in passing, while we're here, do you see how it was well watered everywhere before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. And so what we're expecting to see is that when God destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah, these cities here, the whole area, which had been well watered and fertile, was rendered infertile by this event. That's the implication of those words there. And it's the implication actually of the history of this place after its destruction. So we talked about Lot looking east from Bethel and seeing a disc of Jordan and seeing the cities of the plain. And here is the view today from Bethel and Ai, with the sites which Dr. Collins has identified as being these cities identified. So you can see from Bethel, which is where we're standing, the eastern disc of land across the Jordan. So it seems pretty clear from the Bible where we would expect to find these cities. And I guess when we read the names of these cities in Genesis, they're listed in a particular order always, and they would have been listed, we believe, in the order from south to north. So Sodom, Gomorrah, Admah, Zeboim. And we read, didn't we, how it was well watered everywhere. Well, this is, look at all of the rivers flowing into this region. This is, by any description, it's the best watered agriscape in the region. There's springs, there's rivers. You would never have a situation where this area was not well watered. So they've got both hot springs and cold springs. There is nowhere else in the Jordan Valley which is well watered. This is a hugely fertile region even today, and you can see on the map that we are going to show again in a moment where there's a lot of green areas there. In fact, when the diggers proceeded, what they've understood is that this area has supported uninterrupted habitation all the way from the Chalcolithic period, the Stone Age, through to the early Bronze Age, over 25 centuries, uninterrupted habitation in this area. Unlike, I should say, the rest of the Levant, which went through dark ages where there were climatic changes which made it very hard to live there. This place kept on thriving all the way through those challenges. So here we are then, we're looking across the plain, and I mentioned it was well watered even today, and you can see all of the farming that's going on there, very, very productive region. And it's interesting in passing to note that it seems that this is where Jesus would have been baptised, at the Jordan here, at the crossing of the Jordan there. And what we see is Sodom here has a commanding position, a commanding view over the whole plain. It would have been the key city there. It was sat on both north-south and east-west trade routes. Even today there's a road going by here. And that's why, of course, the Lord Jesus was baptised here, because it was at the place where the Jordan would have been forded for the trade. There's been no evidence that Sodom was ever conquered, even though over its 25 centuries it had several upgrades to its fortifications across the centuries. And there's a huge field all the way around the hill country around about. There's a huge field of dolmens, that is to say standing stones, circles, etc. A continuous field of over 1,000 monuments, around 200 of which are still standing, and we can see some of those here. So you can see a very substantial and probably wealthy, given its position on the trade routes, a very substantial, wealthy and fertile area, a fertile civilization, which was able to spend its time making these dolmens as well. So as we continue to zoom in on the map there, this is the spot we've been sharing on each map, and now you can see this rather large, well, I guess you could call it a hill. It's a tell. It's called Tell el-Hammam. It is not a subtle sight. It's really obvious from the ground as well as from the air. In fact, it's so obvious that you can see they had to route a road round it rather than driving it across it. Also at the top left there you have Tel Kafrain, one of several satellite towns within a few kilometres, and Dr. Collins identifies this likely as Gomorrah. Likely sites for Admah and Zeboim are also a little bit further north from here. And again, let's continue to zoom in. And so you have the upper Acropolis and the lower Tal as well. So this would have been the extent of the city proper, with the with the upper city here, where you would have had the palace and things like that. As I say, it's really, really obvious. This hill, it's a really obvious standout element in the landscape. And even today, as I say, you can walk on that, and the destruction was so complete when it was destroyed. And clearly, if there was a city there, it was destroyed. That destruction was so complete that even after 25 centuries of uninterrupted habitation, there's almost no human life been on this ever since. There was a small Roman garrison there, but since then, nothing. To the extent that you can walk on there now, and underfoot are Bronze Age artefacts, right underfoot at the surface level. And so we mentioned then the commanding views of the whole plain, the river on the side and the hills behind. Ideal from a defensive point of view. Now, some of you will know Len Rittmeyer. He is a architectural... can't remember the name. People who draw buildings. Architect, thank you. Architectural... Anyway, he draws how things might have looked based on what they find in the ground when they're doing their archaeology. So he's an archaeological architect, thank you. So he's then able to draw, to reconstruct, if you like, what the city was likely to look like. And so this is his reconstruction of how the city would have looked in those days. And this is not all made up. This is all how it was, because you can see, as we'll see in a few minutes, these regular defensive turrets along a defensive wall. A very heavily defended place with these slopes as well, so that if you were trying to attack this place, if you managed to scramble your way up these smooth slopes, then they'd be lobbing things on your head from above. So it's a very heavily defended city. Well, why do you defend a city if not because it has wealth? A very successful and a very fertile area. So when was this? Well, when they've been digging there, they've established a timeline. So it was inhabited from Chalcolithic times through the early, middle and late Bronze Age. And then, well, as I say, during the Chalcolithic area, the Kikar was, this disc of land was widely settled and very prosperous, with little fortification in the area. But then in the early Bronze Age, most of the area, most of the Levant, due to climatic disruption, whole cities were deserted. But the Kikar cities, Sodom and Gomorrah, they continued during this time. They continued to prosper because of this well-watered, fertile plain. Successive fortification upgrades they've found on the site over the centuries, despite no evidence actually of ever being conquered. Unique mud brick fortifications for the time. And then around the end of Middle Bronze Age 2, whenever that exactly was, around that time there is a devastating destruction event. Now, the timing of that destruction event is perfect for the Abrahamic era. It's perfect for the time where we read of Abraham and Lot. It's perfect for the time where we read that Lot was led out of Sodom and Gomorrah by the angels. Now, let's be clear, this is the centre of a major city-state, and the archaeology has lots to tell us about the time of the patriarchs, whether or not you agree this is Sodom. But it seems very clear that it is. Given the benefits of the location, the watering from the rivers, the situation on major trade routes, the strategic position, it was never conquered, remember, until this destruction, however that happened, why on earth was it then deserted for centuries? You see, there's this devastating event, and then it's deserted entirely, the whole area, not just these cities, the whole area, deserted for nearly 8 centuries. And then in the Iron Age, there's a small Iron Age settlement that didn't last, and then again, deserted to this very day. If it was so strategically important, why on earth was it deserted? Well, let's see what they've been digging up, shall we? So it's a massive site, and only a fraction have they uncovered so far, but already it tells us much about this tragic ancient city-state. So you see then what they've found around the wall, the city wall, the rampart, the towers, and a temple, a monumental temple complex in the lower tell, Then in the upper tell there's this palace, water systems, etc. Very, very heavily defended, but palaces and monumental complexes as well. Now here is Dr. Collins and a friend on top of the early Bronze Age city wall foundation. And so what they had is they had a foundation that was stone and then mud bricks above the ground. There we are in the lower city. So we have then the early bronze city wall and then the middle bronze city wall built almost on top of it in certain places, right on top. We're talking about a wall here that's 4 or 5 meters wide. This is a very broad wall, especially in those days. This is a story of stability and continuity. These fortifications were not built, they were not broken, they were just upgraded. And so the early bronze foundations, the early bronze fortifications served for something like 750 years with mud bricks on a single course of foundation stones with a road around it. This was simply built on top of to create the middle bronze fortification. It had a huge 35-degree rampart going out for some 35 metres. So in order to attack the city, you had to climb a 35-metre slope before you even get to it. And then a 4 to 6 metre wall, thick wall on top. That's Dr. Collins and his wife Danette on top of that mud brick rampart. So again, this rampart was created from mud bricks, and then it had smooth clay put on top, smooth cementitious coating to make it even harder to scale. It would have been very slippery and hard to get up. There's Dr. Collins at a gateway tower here. So we mentioned those gateways and those towers around the wall. There were tens of these scattered along something like 25 kilometres of fortifications. You're starting to get a picture. Again, another reconstruction by Lane Rittmeyer, which is apparently easier to say than his profession. And that makes me think of Lot, because in another place in the Bible we read that Lot ended up in the gate of Sodom, and so that gives us an idea of the sort of place that Lot would have been frequenting. Again, these huge remains that are being uncovered. So we've got this the Middle Bronze Gateway complex. A is the early Bronze City Wall, B is the early Bronze Gateway, C is the Middle Bronze City Wall, D is the Middle Bronze Left Tower, E is the tower entry. So you're able to, through that tower, able to enter the tower from inside the city there. And then domestic areas, houses and things like that on this side of the wall. You can see the scale of this. This is Bronze Age stuff. And so the city layout remained stable for generations and generations and centuries. And when age overcame homes, they were just rebuilt on the same plan. Things would eventually fall over and just be rebuilt. The king had a massive palace in which all of the pottery could be described as fine pottery, nothing but the best for him. And the construction, this isn't Tel el-Hammam. This is, in 2017, this is a place called Taos Pueblo in New Mexico. But Collins suggests that this is the kind of construction that was used in Tel el-Hammam. Here is a close-up of the palace itself. You can see the very well-crafted mud bricks, again on a stone foundation. So this is the palace. It's inside, of course, all of the fortifications, but even the palace has walls that are more than a metre thick. Incredible. They even had plaster. You can see plaster then on the wall of the palace in the upper city. This is again Bronze Age stuff. And they managed to find potsherds and pots representing many thousands of pots already, even with the digging they've been able to do so far. So amazing artifacts. Again, remember this is Bronze Age stuff. Consider what we were doing in Britain in the Bronze Age. Nothing on this scale. Some alabaster vessel with a beautiful geometric design on it. So a very advanced civilization for the time. It's increasingly clear though. So we've been talking about this massive destruction event where there's an ash layer more than a metre thick, where there are human bones on the site, not in skeletons but scattered across the site. Sorry to be macabre for a moment. It's increasingly clear that Tel el-Hammam suffered an airburst event. Now we'll get on to what an airburst is for a moment. But I mentioned this metre-thick destruction layer, which is very, very thick. This is the layer in which you find these ashes. There is blast damage, so it's as if there was a bomb went off nearby and blew things apart. Highly directional, extreme heat damage. So on one side of the palace, you can see that the wall is scorched. On a different side, right next to it, not scorched at all. Very directional, extreme heat damage. On the left here, you have a piece of pottery from el-Hammam, and you can see that the surface of this pottery has been turned into glass. Now, the temperature you need for that is very, very high already, but turning just the surface into glass and leaving, you can see through the thickness, it's stayed the same. You need something like 10 or 15,000 Celsius for a fraction of a second to accomplish that. And how do we know that? Well, because the piece on the right is a similar artifact, but actually that's called trinitite. That is from the site of a nuclear blast in New Mexico. So we're seeing huge amounts of energy being released instantaneously in this place. Now, there have been large events that have released a lot of energy on this planet in the past, and we have evidence of that sort of thing with the sorts of crater that you can find on the Earth's surface. Happily, events of that scale are very rare. But actually, what we can call bolide events, a bolide is a meteor or a comet or something like that comes into our atmosphere. Those events are actually rather common. This is really just in the scale of about 20 years. These are small asteroids that disintegrate in the Earth's atmosphere. And you can see only over that 20-year or so period, we're seeing something like 600 bolide events. Now, happily, it's rare that these events happen near civilization. You may have heard of one that happened in a place called Chelyabinsk only a few years ago in 2013. Now, I'm hoping I can show you a video of this. Maybe some time sorting this out. Forgive me, right, I think I'm nearly there. So, here we have somebody's dash cam. So somebody's driving along in Russia and they're sat at the traffic lights and suddenly they see this going across their windscreen and it gets brighter and brighter and finally it explodes, bang, and there's just a few more particles that then run through the atmosphere. So that's a really graphic visual of a bolide event. Now that event injured 1,500 people. It damaged something like 7,000 buildings, and that was even though it didn't really come into the atmosphere over any particular cities. So it had huge destructive power, even though in the video we just saw, and there's a graphic or a picture of the display there, and you can see kind of a mushroom cloud there from the explosive event. This was an object only about 20 metres in diameter, something like the size of this room, perhaps a little bit larger, travelling at 19 kilometres per second. A lot of energy. Energy on entry was something like 500 kilotons of TNT. That's 30 Hiroshima bombs. Eyewitnesses felt intense heat. As I say, 1,500 were injured, mostly from blown windows, in this case from the shock wave, which obviously caused this blast damage. And there was damage to 7,200 buildings across 6 cities, including roofs fallen in and things like that. The most powerful bolide event in recorded history actually flattened hundreds of square miles of forest, again coincidentally in Russia. This was about 10 megatons of TNT 1,000 times the power of the Hiroshima bomb. Hundreds of square miles of forest flattened by this event. And here, this is an actual bomb rather than a bolide event, but what you can see is a bomb just above the decoy aeroplane there. This is a Tomahawk missile detonating above a test target, and you can see as it detonates, the test target receives enormous heat and energy before the explosive products even reach it. So that's the sort of thing, that's the sort of destruction you can get from a bolide event. And so the leading theory, this is now from the archaeology, not necessarily from the biblical text, this is the archaeology of that site. The leading theory is that there was a bolide event at Tunguska scale, that is to say that 10 megatons of TNT event in Russia that flattened hundreds of square miles of forest, that there was a bolide event of that sort of scale occurring over the northeast Dead Sea. And they can see from the way in which different buildings were charred the direction from which this came. The idea is that salt and sulfides would have polluted the land, and indeed at the Chelyabinsk event, people were reporting that they could smell sulphur in the area for about a day afterwards. And indeed, when we read in the Bible about brimstone, that means sulphur. So again, this is giving the idea that this is eyewitness record of an event that happened because people smelled sulphur from this, we think, bolide event. And so this idea that this bolide event happened over the Dead Sea, splashed a huge amount of Dead Sea water onto the land, this very, very fertile land, and effectively salted it. And we know that Roman soldiers would salt the land behind them to effectively cripple the local population from being able to grow anything. So it would be that it would not be worth going to live there for 8 centuries because the land was salted. And indeed, when they've been digging, they've found thick layers of salt in the destroyed cities. And so it would have caused then this blast and heat damage to the cities of the plain and their inhabitants. So that's the leading theory for what caused this archaeological event. And it's, for me, it's really striking how it lines up with the biblical event. There was fire and brimstone from the Lord out of heaven. So the fire, we've seen the effect of that. There would have been huge blast damage. It would have been heard and felt. People would have felt the heat on their skin hundreds of miles away. And then when they went to see what had happened, they would have found the cities destroyed and the smell of sulphur in the air. It's increasingly clear to me that the sites that they've found are indeed biblical Sodom and Gomorrah. That this, what we read here, is not a far-fetched myth, but really an accurate eyewitness account of the instantaneous destruction of a major and long-lived city-state that brought it to nothing, such that it was uninhabited, and indeed a proverb for mourning for the centuries which followed. So, what do we do about that then? For me, it's just another piece of evidence that what we read in the Bible is really a good record of what happened at the time, and perhaps when we see that the record is accurate about the destruction of these cities, perhaps we should consider whether it's also accurate about the reason for it. That is to say that God had warned this city about its immorality, and eventually destruction came. So it is that in our time we've been warned that the Lord Jesus is coming to set up God's kingdom on earth. And so it is for us now to respond to God's warning and to turn to the Lord Jesus Christ. Thank you.